Now, the Netherlands is often referred to as the logistics turntable of Europe, with the ports of Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and Amsterdam Schiphol airport all so vital to the flow of goods and the efficiency of European and global supply chains. But it's also well known that the Netherlands is, also unintentionally, interesting for international illicit drug trafficking. Now, as part of the Dutch Ministry of Justice's ongoing work to identify and tackle this problem, it commissioned a special study on vulnerability in crime in the transport sector, and especially in the road freight sector. We went to Amsterdam to speak with one of the authors of the breakthrough requested study, criminologist Dr. Eric Bervoets. Let's take a look at Eric's presentation now.
My name is Eric Bervoets. Thank you very much for having me. I will share with you some insights about our research into vulnerabilities to crime in road transport and logistics in the Netherlands. I'm a criminologist. I've got my own research agency since 2009. I frequently work with Dutch universities and the Netherlands Defence Academy. Until 2007, I was employed by the Dutch Police Academy, and I used to lecture criminology at the Dutch Studies Centre of Justice. I publish frequently on policing, criminal networks and drug economy. My projects most of the time have a strong focus on applied social research. On one of the last covers of the German magazine Der Spiegel, the Dutch cheese girl Frau Antje is depicted with a Kalashnikov in her hand and a joint between her lips. She carries a cheese in which cocaine is hidden. So much for the image of the Netherlands. It is good to keep in mind that the Netherlands are the logistics turntable of Europe with the ports of Rotterdam, Amsterdam and Amsterdam Airport. From empirical research and criminal cases, we know that the Netherlands are unintentionally interesting for international illicit drug trafficking. Transport is essential to criminal networks. Within this context, what was wanted by the Ministry of Justice was research on vulnerability to crime in road transport of goods, with 3 goals and a focus on the Netherlands. 1. Providing insight into vulnerabilities, for there had not been an up-to-date overview of potential and actual vulnerabilities to crime in the Dutch world of transport and logistics since the extensive research of Professor Frank Bovenkerk of Utrecht University in the late 90s. Yes, there have been since criminological studies on specific elements, but it was time in 2020 for a new and more comprising picture of the sector. Second, recommendations to make the transport world resilient and agile towards crime and criminal networks. And third, recommendations on public-private partnerships to realize this. In my presentation, I will address the key findings and main conclusions of the study, but not before thanking Tapa IMEA first for the opportunity to share the findings of our study with you. Unfortunately, I had not been able to present during your conference, but nevertheless, I wish you all a pleasant day and a fruitful event. I conducted this study in a team of fellow criminologists and an investigative journalist. So I present on behalf of our team. The research questions were quite extensive, but boiled down they were, what vulnerabilities are there? What's the criminal abuse companies are suffering from? And what measures are already being taken? And what solutions are possible? But again, with a focus on the Netherlands. The empirical focus of this study was mainly on organized crime, that is, illicit drug trafficking, people smuggling, cargo theft and organizational crime. By the latter, we mean crime committed by companies themselves or their employees in an attempt to circumvent licenses and legislation. I will not bore you with methodological details of this study design at all. Most important to stress now is that the study had a rather strong streetwise element. By that I mean that we combined literature research, studying statistics and doing interviews with going on the spot to look around and ask questions. Even during the COVID pandemic, we found opportunities to do so. For example, we visited a secure truck stop in Venlo to interview truck drivers. We drove a few times with drivers and we visited some companies where we got a tour and interviewed people on the spot. It's also worth noting that our investigative journalist had the access and skills to do research on Telegram and dark web as a part of his open sources analysis. Telegram and dark web are well known for facilitating criminals because these are not easily accessible to the outside world. We soon learned that both media are used as well to offer transport-related criminal services and circumvent rules. For example, fake Euro licenses were offered and persons and companies were asked to help smuggling illicit drugs. When it comes to the extent of criminal abuse, we do not get any further than numerically substantiated estimates of trends and numbers. After all, there is always a so-called dark number for all crime. By this we mean crimes that have not come to the attention of the police or other investigative authorities. Certainly, in the case of criminal abuse in the transport sector, account must be taken of the fact that, for the most part, there are also offences that cannot be reported at all. Think of smuggling. And in addition, insofar as reporting to the police is possible, the willingness to file a declaration is rather low in the Dutch transport sector. In the Dutch sector, there's an unwritten subcultural rule to arrange as much possible yourself. Sometimes the sector is experienced by the outside world as somewhat closed and inaccessible. Then if we look at criminal cases, recently there has been intensified attention, for in the Netherlands the enforcement agencies initiated a national project on transport facilitating organized crime. Then cargo theft is a permanent problem as well in Holland, with strong varying attention of law enforcement agencies. People smuggling. We observed a peak in 2016 which had to do with a war and human crisis in Syria and Iraq, so in the Middle East. We have to keep in mind as well the existence of the so-called registration effects. For figures on crime, transport-related crimes as well say more about the efforts of law enforcement organizations than the actual extent of crime. Then if we look at the table with figures of Dutch customs, for example, in the explanation of the half-year figures for 2020, the Dutch customs pay particular attention to the large increase in cocaine seizures and the increase in synthetic drug finds in mail and parcels. More intensive cooperation with both national and international partners has enabled customs to seize more cocaine. This mainly concerns maritime catches in the ports of Rotterdam and Flushing, that is. It is unknown to what extent the increase is related to the impact of the COVID-19 virus. After all, the upward trend had been observable since 2018. And like I stated before, much transport-related crime incidents are not reported to the Dutch police by companies. Sometimes because the companies assume that the police don't follow up after all, or incidents are dealt with internally by private or company investigators. Investigation services really need to invest in their relationship with companies to gain insight. The assumed dark numbers therefore large. And again, the figures say more about the efforts of law enforcement than about actual extent of crime. Then what is new? At the end of the 90s, a major study was carried out in the Netherlands into the transport sector by criminologist Professor Frank Bovenkerk of Utrecht University. This was part in the light of a parliamentary inquiry into organized crime. Compared to that study, we have identified few new forms of crime in the road transport world. It is still in particular the economic competition and the sometimes weak financial position that makes some companies more vulnerable to be influenced by organized crime than others. This has not altered since the end of the 90s when Professor Bovenkerk conducted his study. Nevertheless, we also found some new elements. Related to crime phenomena, those were, for example, cybercrime, like hacking aimed to acquire locations of freight, orders and freight lists. Freight exchange fraud via online platforms and offering transport-related criminal services and circumvent rules via Telegram and dark web, like I stated before. PIN fraud. A pilot was recently announced in the Port of Rotterdam for container handling without the PIN code. The code itself is very common in the sector. Before the pilot, the code needed to retrieve a container regularly ended up in the hands of malicious parties. Related to vulnerabilities to crime, new elements are flexibility in the labour market. Contractors feel less responsible than employees, and flexibility more than once induces financial vulnerabilities. Then digitization, track and trace, digital orders and digital freight lists. E-commerce, ordering via the internet by individuals and companies makes vulnerable. And then related to interventions, our observation is promoting alertness and an internal willingness of companies and employees to report crime and irregularities as a new intervention. Then on public-private partnerships, because one of the research questions was to examine how these partnerships can contribute to a road sector that is resilient and agile against organized crime. The international cooperation between governments and industry organizations, or the lack of it, is seen as a problem by the interviewees in our studies. Companies indicate that transport crime cannot be tackled properly without an international approach, because the criminal alliances often work internationally, and the chains in logistics and transport are also international. If one country enforces and the other does not, or less so, this will also cause problems, for example. A chain approach with attention to the transnational character of the problem is necessary to really increase the sector's resilience. There are, however, attempts by trying to establish public-private partnerships. Distrust in the government stands in the way of them, however. Dutch companies experience many rules but little enforcement. However, the enforcement had recently been intensified by special projects with more focus on the togetherness with the industry. Responsiveness is also considered important. It is give and take, or take but also give. It is time to benefit more from each other's expertise and intelligence. Know the unwritten rules and lingo of the sector of each other. Do not treat private partners as junior partners, but on the basis of equality. In this way, public agencies build a relationship of trust and good basis for increasing the willingness to report crime, for example. Do not forget that companies have their focus on loss prevention rather than on fighting crime. The lack of expertise amongst law enforcement would also regularly affect the willingness to report transport-related crime by companies. The fact that knowledge and expertise about the transport sector is necessary to be able to work together effectively is something that clearly emerges from our study. And the lack of continuity also appears to be an obstacle in various public-private relationships. Changing portfolio holders, lack of financial or reduced political attention contribute to the fact that even very successful initiatives are not continued. It is important that even the collaboration, if it stops or is scaled down, the parties still manage to find each other if the collaboration, perhaps with a small shift in emphasis, proves necessary again in the future, some other way. In the end, it is often the same parties who encounter each other in different contexts. If the network remains in order, you can switch quickly if necessary. The government, the police, the insurers, and the transport sector do not exist as such. All have great diversity. The public sector is often a maze for private parties, and public parties tend often to forget the smaller companies and focus on the larger ones. It's important to realize that. And at the same time, that should not prevent public-private collaboration. It is a search for opportunities, for where the energy and common interests are in order to achieve a fruitful collaboration. Then concerning inside threat, because I know that TAPA EMEA finds this really important. The main fear is the intimidation and the power of drug smuggling networks. Violence, however, is only used as a last resort. But when it does happen, it is often rude and menacing. Recently, we've experienced incidents with violence to transport companies in the Netherlands. However, it is more likely to be threatened and subtly influenced, for example, by approaching employees or contractors of companies or governmental organizations via social media, in the catering industry, or even, we heard in our interviews, through local leisure networks. Even the local football club is a place to try to get in contact with employees by criminal elements. All kinds of network methods are used to approach people to collect information about them, for example about debts or problems with the employer, and to influence their behavior. As a result of inside threats, some Dutch companies facilitated unintentionally drug transports. Suitable drivers are actively recruited for the illicit drug transports, and a Dutch customs officer had recently been arrested on suspicion of corruption and money laundering. So then what can be done to help the industry? There seem to be many good initiatives already in the Netherlands and elsewhere to fight transport-facilitated organized crime. However, most initiatives are of recent date, and incidents and a surge of urgency was needed to have them started in the first place. Transport-facilitated crime is not automatically high on the policy agenda, not with the government and not for private parties. I should stress the point of awareness, and for example there is training. Give space to the police, company detectives and insurers to share investigation requested messages, as we call them, and occasionally invite someone with a practical background to share tips and tricks. What should you pay attention to? How can you park as safely as possible if you cannot park in a secure park lot? In this way, not only is the chance of being caught, thanks to the extra eyes and the ears of drivers and other employees and contractors, is increased, but also awareness to crime and abuse is increased. Take into account the financial situation and life events without having the ambition to become a big brother, but with the ambition to be a motivating employer or client. Keep asking questions. Are there specific persons vulnerable to crime? Has there been changing behavior? Keep in mind that financial debts or certain life events make people more vulnerable to crime or getting influenced and recruited by criminal networks. Then the element of enforcement, expertise, intelligence, and an own account holder for bona fide companies is needed. Bona fide parties must have an incentive and legal possibility to quickly call an investigating officer in the event of suspicious shipment, and who can determine whether there are any irregularities. Someone from customs or a police officer with an expertise on transport and logistics could do that. This could also include VIP treatment of bona fide cooperating companies during customs controls and inspections, so that business operations are not held up for too long and damage is limited. This could also include offering a follow-up guarantee with police reports in case where there is a lot of evidence. Then I want to stress the title of this presentation, a breakthrough, because a breakthrough is wanted, for not many elements have changed concerning transport-related crime since the late 90s when Professor Bovenkerk conducted his study in the Netherlands. A breakthrough is wanted for the focus of the governmental policies had been too much on law enforcement and symptoms, and not so much on the multiple breeding ground of transport-related crime. However, law enforcement experienced highly variable urgency. There is still a problem with a follow-up of reports to the police. And a breakthrough in this dossier requires a view from various disciplines, we assume, as a starting point for a resilient and agile transport sector, a sector that is safe and bona fide. Like I stated already, do not treat private partners as junior partners, but on the basis of equality. In this way, public agencies build up a relationship of trust and a good basis for increasing the willingness to report crime, for example. And do not forget that companies have their focus on loss prevention, like I said, and less on fighting crime. And last but not least, I want to stress again that transport crime cannot be tackled properly without an international approach. A chain approach with attention to the transnational character of the problem of drug smuggling, for example, is necessary to really increase the sector's resilience. Thank you very much for your attention. And I thank again TAPE Mayor for inviting me, and have a fruitful event.